On April 17, 2026, the night over the coast looked calm from a distance. Then the sky opened like a ripped seam. People thought this was about iron and rockets, about bravery and radar screens. It wasn't, because the ledger had already picked the winner, and it was ruthless. We think wars are decided by who fires first or who has better pilots. But this war was decided by a balance sheet that couldn't lie. The real front line was the purchase order, the invoice, the replacement schedule. Empires don't always lose by defeat. They lose by bankruptcy and quiet insolvency. Somewhere in a fluorescent war room, a colonel stared at a number he hated: $2.5 million per interceptor, per trigger pull, per breath. That price wasn't a rumor. It was a line item with a signature. And line items have no mercy. Now picture the incoming threat, not as a missile, but as a receipt, a cheap receipt printed in bulk, stacked high, easy to replace. One side pays in hard currency. The other side pays in volume, and volume is a weapon. The most seductive myth in modern war is that technology is a shield. The shield looks polished on parade days. It looks invincible on marketing videos, but shields are rented, not owned, when the supply chain is thin, and rent is due every time the siren sings. At Isra's peak, the illusion was breathtaking. Glass towers glittered like coins under noon sun. Parades of hardware rolled with perfect timing and perfect paint. The country looked like a fortress built from mathematics. The defense architecture had layers like a luxury suit. Long range, mid-range, short range, all stitched into a single narrative of control. It promised the public a simple bargain: pay taxes, trust the system, sleep at night. It was a national insurance policy. The world applauded because the numbers looked clean: high interception rates, quick alerts, discipline drills. It felt like the future had arrived early, and the future, they said, belonged to the most advanced. But beneath the surface, the foundation was rotting, not because the engineers were fools, not because the soldiers lacked skill. It rotted because every layer was also a meter running, and the meter never stops. Defense is a subscription service with blood as the penalty for late payment. Each launch costs money, but each interception costs more. Each reload costs time, but each delay costs fear, and fear is expensive. This is where the trap snaps shut, like a steel bear clamp in tall grass. The addiction is not to war. The addiction is to certainty. Certainty makes leaders careless with cash. The fatal flaw was a love affair with Hickost perfection. The system was built to intercept a single clean object in a clean arc. It was built to win a duel, not survive a brawl. That difference is not academic. It is financial. Then the antagonist arrives, wearing no uniform. It is the market for interceptors and the tempo of manufacturing. It is the production ceiling, the delivery timeline, the export approvals. It is the cold hand of capacity. Call it the interceptor market, the quiet tyrant. It doesn't shout propaganda. It doesn't threaten borders. It just asks a simple question: how many can you buy this month, and how many can you fire tonight? In this story, the most dangerous weapon isn't the missile itself. It is the weapon that forces you to overspend. It is the weapon that turns your defense into a furnace. It burns cash faster than it burns fuel. Iran's new answer was not a miracle device. It was a brutal accounting trick wrapped in steel. A warhead that opens and scatters smaller pieces. Not one target, but dozens of deaths falling at once. Imagine a single body climbing high and then splitting like a cracked safe. The contents don't explode in one place. They spread, drift, and land wherever gravity feels like collecting. Each small piece becomes its own threat. You cannot negotiate with gravity. You cannot intercept what has no engine and no single path. You can only pray it lands in empty space. And prayer is not a procurement strategy. So the defenders do what defenders always do. They fire early, and they fire twice, and sometimes 3 times. Because a miss over a city is not an error. It is a resignation letter written in smoke. That is where the ledger starts to scream. $2.5 million multiplied by caution. $2.5 million multiplied by uncertainty. $2.5 million multiplied by panic at 2 a.m. Now, let that number sink in. 2 interceptors for 1 threat is $5 million. 4 interceptors is $10 million. In a week of heavy fire, you can burn a hospital budget on the sky alone. The public sees streaks and fireworks. Accountants see depletion rates. Generals see readiness curves dipping like a pulse. Politicians see the next funding vote, and they taste metal in their mouths. Iran, meanwhile, doesn't need perfection. Iran needs volume and timing. It needs a weapon that forces the other side to spend like a drowning man buying air. It needs to turn defense into a debt spiral. This is the economic trap, and it works like addiction. The more you intercept, the safer you feel. The safer you feel, the more you promise. The more you promise, the more you must intercept. Then, one night, the cluster payload arrived. The radar tracks one object. The doctrine responds to one object. The interceptor hits the mother body, and everyone exhales too soon, because the real threat already left the package. This is the inversion that breaks the architecture. The defense system can win the duel and still lose the street. The missile can die in the sky, while the fragments keep falling. The battlefield moves from airspace to sidewalks, and sidewalks don't come with radar. Sidewalks have schools, buses, markets, and night shift workers. Sidewalks have children who pick up strange objects because curiosity is older than fear. Sidewalks are where the war becomes personal. This is where the story gets darker. Like a detective walking into a room after the gunshot. You don't chase the shooter anymore. You document the aftermath. You mark the evidence and count the pieces. The math becomes grotesque. One incoming body can release 24, 48, sometimes 80 scattered hazards. Even if only a fraction detonates, the rest becomes sleeping debts. They wait, unpaid, in rubble and grass. A normal missile is a single bill due immediately. A dispersing payload is a mortgage of danger. It amortizes harm over weeks and months. Cleanup crews become interest payments. Now, the timeline starts its spiral. On March 2nd, 2026, the first dispersal event is caught on phones. On March 6, 2026, a second follows, and the emergency hotlines clog. By March 10, 2026, the warnings become routine, which is its own kind of tragedy. Routine is how societies accept the unacceptable. Routine is how terror becomes a schedule. Routine is how a state pays for war twice, once in cash and once in nerves. And nerves don't recover quickly. By late March 2026, the numbers stop being abstract. Suppose 200 ballistic threats arrive in a week. Suppose the defense fires 300 interceptors in response. At $2.5 million each, that is $750 million in a week. That isn't a sensational headline. It is arithmetic. It is payroll, fuel, maintenance, and the future poured into air. It is money that cannot rebuild a damaged neighborhood. It is money that cannot be spent twice. Now flip the ledger. Suppose the attacker's cost per missile averages $300,000. 200 missiles cost $60 million against $750 million in defense shots. The ratio is an accountant's nightmare. This is how cheap weapons beat expensive shields. Not by slipping through every time. They win by forcing the defender to overpay for every attempt. The defender can be brilliant and still be bled. The rule of three arrives like a verdict. The cash was burning. The stockpiles were thinning. The factories were too slow. And each problem made the other two worse. In early April 2026, procurement officers start using the language of scarcity. They don't say victory. They say allocation. They don't say dominance. They say prioritization. Those are the words you hear before insolvency. Because stockpiles are not patriotism. Stockpiles are not slogans. Stockpiles are pallets in warehouses counted by clerks. When the pallets shrink, rhetoric cannot refill them. This is when allies become part of the story, even if they hate the spotlight. Resupply becomes a diplomatic currency. Manufacturing slots become favors. A shipment date becomes a strategic promise. And promises have prices. A rush order costs more per unit. A faster delivery squeezes other buyers. Someone always pays for urgency. The only question is who pays and how publicly. By April 12, 2026, the defense economy looks like a stretched rubber band. One more surge and something snaps. Not necessarily the radar, not necessarily the crews. Something simpler snaps first. The budget tolerance. Budgets are political skin. They feel pain long before bones break. Leaders can hide casualties. They can hide shortages. They cannot hide invoices forever, because invoices show up in committees and audits. Now we reach the smoking gun moment, the quiet meeting that seals fate. On April 14, 2026, a closed-door session happens at a nondescript office block. No flags, no cameras, just binders and tired eyes. The document is stamped, numbered, and boring to anyone without imagination. It is called the Emergency Interceptor Allocation Memorandum. NXC, it reads like a foreclosure notice dressed as policy. It says, in polite words, you can't cover everything. A defense official leans forward and paraphrases the brutal truth. We can protect the heartland, or we can protect the periphery. Another voice answers, then we will accept losses and manage the narrative. That is liquidation language, even if nobody says the word. This is the moment the state sells parts of itself to stay solvent. Not land, not officially. It sells certainty. It sells equal protection. It sells the idea that every citizen is covered the same. In noir stories, the killer is often a paper trail. Here, the paper trail is the killer and the confession. The memorandum becomes a ledger entry that future historians will circle in red. It is not defeat. It is a controlled default. Because default doesn't always look like collapse. Sometimes it looks like a calm announcement and a new set of rules. Sometimes it looks like a void unexploded debris becoming a nightly reminder. Sometimes default looks like adaptation. Then the climax arrives, not with fireworks, but with a missing shipment. On April 20th, 2026, imagine a freighter delayed a factory behind schedule, a component stuck in export review. Small friction, huge consequence. The next week, interceptors are rationed like medicine. The launch decisions change tone. The crews ask for authorization more often. The chain of command grows longer because every shot is a million-dollar question. This is when the money literally runs out in practical terms. The accounts may still have digits, but the usable inventory, the ready rounds, the available launchers, they hit the wall. A nation can have cash and still lack capability. Now watch the social consequences spread. Shelters filled with families holding bags like refugees inside their own cities. Workdays shortened because the commute feels like a gamble. Parents start mapping routes by Syrian coverage. Hunger doesn't always mean famine. Sometimes hunger is empty shelves of normal life. It is the absence of trust, the missing bread of routine. It is the cold feeling that tomorrow is not promised. Humiliation follows, quiet and corrosive. People stop boasting about the shield. They start asking what it costs and why. They start seeing the defense not as a triumph, but as a bill collector's trap. And that is when the narrator's knife turns. Sovereignty is solvency. If you cannot afford your defense tempo, you do not fully own your decisions. If you need emergency shipments to keep breathing, someone else holds your oxygen. This is the real loss of sovereignty, and it doesn't require invasion. It requires dependency and a production bottleneck. It requires a supply chain that cannot sprint forever. It requires the ledger to tighten like a noose. Now, the attacker's strategy sharpens. It doesn't need to strike every day. It needs to spike, pause, then spike again. It needs to make the defender waste readiness on false alarms and uncertain tracks. It needs to turn nerves into spending, because the defender's hidden cost is not just the interceptor. It is the constant mobilization. It is overtime pay, maintenance cycles, replacement parts, burnout. It is the invisible hemorrhage under the armor, and the dispersing payload adds a second bill. Cleanup and disposal, street closures, specialized teams, medical response on standby. The weapon taxes you after it lands, like interest charged after a missed payment. This is how the war becomes a financial history thriller. The hero isn't a pilot. The hero is a procurement officer trying to stretch inventory like a magician. The villain isn't a general. The villain is the calendar. Time is the creditor that never forgives. Each day consumes rounds. Each week consumes morale. Each month consumes the myth of control. You can win a battle and still lose the quarter. Now imagine the defender's annual defense budget as a dam. The interceptors are a crack that widens with each strike. At first, the leak is manageable. Then the leak becomes a stream. Then it becomes a flood that rewrites everything. Leaders begin moving money from civilian projects. Infrastructure delays become temporary. Health spending becomes flexible. Education budgets become reviewable. War doesn't just kill people, it eats the future. By May 2026, private markets react like animals sensing fire. Insurance premiums jump. Investors demand higher yields. Borrowing costs rise by 2 points, then 3, then 5. A state can intercept missiles and still be downgraded. And when borrowing costs rise, every ministry feels it. Debt service swells like a tumor. The government prints reassurance, but it cannot print trust. Trust is earned, and war burns it. This is where the ledger becomes a crime scene. Every emergency line item is a fingerprint. Every rushed contract is a motive. Every delayed audit is a shadow where corruption can grow, because war spending attracts parasites. Middlemen appear with solutions. Consultants appear with shortcuts. Everyone wants a piece of the panic budget, and panic budgets are easy to steal from. Somewhere, a watchdog writes a memo nobody reads. It warns about price gouging on components, about expedited shipping scams, about subcontractors billing twice. It is ignored because sirens are louder than paperwork. Now the generational aftermath starts forming, even before the last explosion. Debts taken in a crisis don't vanish when the crisis ends. They sit on the national balance sheet like scar tissue. They reduce options for decades. Suppose the emergency campaign costs $40 billion in direct and indirect expenses. Suppose the state finances half through new bonds at 7% interest. That interest alone becomes a yearly wound, bleeding $1.4 billion, and that bleed lasts. If the bonds mature over 30 years, the final check isn't written until 2056. Think about the scale of that. A child born during the sirens could be middle-aged before the war's invoice is fully paid. That is the generational curse of defense economics. You don't just rebuild buildings. You rebuild credit. You rebuild confidence. And those are slower than concrete. Meanwhile, the contamination problem lingers, physical and psychological. Even after a ceasefire, people still scan sidewalks. Construction crews still pause for suspicious objects. The war remains underfoot, like broken glass in a carpet. The children grow up with a different sense of normal. They memorize shelter routes before they memorize songs. They learn the vocabulary of debris before the vocabulary of dreams. That is a kind of theft. Years later, politicians will argue about courage and strategy. They will argue about alliances and ideology, but the accountants will point to a simpler narrative. The costs outpaced the capacity, and capacity decides survival. Because history is not decided by speeches. It is decided by resources that can be replaced. It is decided by factories that can scale. It is decided by whether the balance sheet can keep its promises. So when you hear the title, don't picture a single unstoppable weapon. Picture a weaponized mismatch between price and volume. Picture a cheap key that fits an expensive lock. Picture a ledger that punishes arrogance. This is why the Interceptor's price matters more than its sophistication. $2.5 million is not just a number. It is a countdown, because every launch burns time and future. Even victories can be unaffordable. And this is why dispersing payloads terrify planners. They don't just threaten lives, they threaten budgets, readiness, and the very idea of comprehensive defense. They force a nation to choose what it can afford to save. If you take only one lesson, take this one. The battlefield is not only the sky, it is the spreadsheet. The decisive weapon is not always explosive, it is sustainable. The winning side is often the one that can pay longer. The ledger doesn't care about flags. The ledger doesn't care about pride. It only cares about inputs and outputs, about rates and reserves. And when reserves hit zero, ideology becomes decoration. So the next time someone tells you war is about courage, ask for the numbers. Ask for the stockpile. Ask for the production rate. Ask what happens when the next shipment is late. Because in the end, sovereignty is solvency. And solvency is a choice made years before the sirens start.